For 8 years, the Alpha King hunted a scent that vanished whenever he got close. The words had become a whisper that traveled through every corner of the Northern Territories. Some called it a legend. Others called it an obsession. But no one dared say it was untrue. Because every wolf in the kingdom knew that when King Damian Blackthorn wanted something, he eventually found it. The only exception was the mysterious scent that had escaped him for nearly a decade. The moon hung high above Blackthorn City, casting silver light across stone towers and winding streets as thousands of lanterns flickered to life. The annual Moon Festival had arrived, and people from every pack gathered inside the royal capital. Merchants filled the streets. Musicians played beneath strings of glowing lights. Noble families stepped from polished carriages, while servants hurried through crowded pathways carrying trays of food and decorations. It was the grandest celebration of the year, a night when every wolf in the kingdom hoped to be noticed. Yet among the crowds, there was one woman who wanted the exact opposite. Vivian Hartwell kept her head lowered as she crossed the eastern courtyard of the palace. Her simple navy blue dress blended easily among the dozens of attendants moving through the festival preparations. That was exactly how she liked it. Invisible, unremarkable, forgotten. She adjusted the leather satchel hanging at her side and quietly slipped through a side entrance into the palace library. The scent of old books and cedarwood welcomed her immediately. It was calmer here, safer. The distant sounds of celebration became muted behind thick stone walls. Vivian released a slow breath and locked the door behind her. Then she reached into her satchel and removed a small cloth pouch. Inside were dried herbs carefully prepared the night before. Her fingers trembled slightly as she crushed a portion into a ceramic cup. A faint earthy aroma drifted into the air. She added hot water and watched the mixture swirl. For a moment, her reflection appeared on the surface. Pale skin, soft brown hair, gray-blue eyes that always looked more tired than her age should allow. 22 years old and still hiding. 8 years of caution. 8 years of fear. 8 years of pretending to be someone she was not. Vivian lifted the cup and drank slowly. The bitter taste lingered on her tongue. It always did. But within minutes, the herbs would once again conceal the scent she had spent most of her life trying to hide. A knock suddenly echoed through the library door. Vivian nearly dropped the cup. "Vivian," a cheerful voice called. "Are you hiding in there again?" She recognized the voice immediately. Clara Benson, another palace attendant. Vivian quickly set the cup aside before opening the door. Clara stepped inside carrying a stack of papers and smiled. "I knew I'd find you here." Vivian forced a smile. "Someone has to organize the festival records." Clara rolled her eyes dramatically. "Tonight is the Moon Festival. Half the kingdom is outside celebrating. You should at least come see the opening ceremony." Vivian shook her head. "Crowds aren't really my thing." "That's because you spend all your time hiding between bookshelves." Clara laughed. "One day I'm going to drag you into the ballroom myself." Vivian laughed softly, but the sound faded quickly. If Clara knew the truth, she would understand why crowded rooms terrified her. Why every festival felt dangerous. Why every gathering of wolves reminded her that one mistake could change everything. Clara continued chatting as she sorted documents onto a nearby table. Meanwhile, Vivian found her gaze drifting toward the tall window overlooking the palace grounds. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights illuminated the city below. Somewhere among those crowds, nobles and alphas celebrated beneath the moon. Somewhere beyond the mountains, patrols carried the king's banners across distant territories. And somewhere inside the palace itself was the man she had spent years avoiding. Damian Blackthorn, the Alpha King, the strongest wolf in the kingdom. A ruler respected by allies and rivals alike. Vivian had only seen him a handful of times from a distance. Yet every encounter left her with the same uneasy feeling. As though his silver eyes could somehow see through every disguise. As though he might discover the truth she had worked so hard to bury. A sudden horn blast echoed across the city. Then another. Clara rushed toward the window. "He's here." Excitement filled her voice. The king just returned. Cheers erupted outside. The celebration instantly grew louder. Vivian felt her heartbeat stumble. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Far below, thousands of people flooded toward the central courtyard. The Alpha King had arrived. Clara hurried toward the door. "Come on. Everyone's going." Vivian opened her mouth to refuse. But before she could speak, a strange feeling settled over her chest. Cold, sharp, familiar. The same warning she had felt countless times before. The instinct that had kept her hidden for 8 years. Somewhere outside, surrounded by thousands of voices and lights, destiny had just taken a step closer. And for the first time in a very long time, Vivian was no longer sure she could stay invisible. Some secrets were not hidden because they were shameful. Some were hidden because they were dangerous. Vivian remained frozen beside the library window long after Clara hurried away. The celebration outside continued to swell as wave after wave of excited voices filled the palace grounds. Lanterns glowed beneath the night sky like scattered stars, and somewhere beyond the crowds, royal guards escorted the king toward the central courtyard. Her pulse refused to slow. That familiar warning still lingered in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her life, always moments before something changed. Vivian turned away from the window and locked the library door once more. Then she crossed the room and knelt beside a wooden cabinet hidden behind one of the shelves. Her fingers moved carefully across the carved surface until they found a small latch. A soft click echoed through the quiet room. Inside sat a weathered box wrapped in faded blue cloth. Vivian stared at it for several seconds before finally opening it. The contents had not changed in years. A silver hair ribbon, a worn photograph, and a folded letter with creases so old they had begun to fade. She reached for the photograph. First, the image showed a smiling couple standing beside a small farmhouse surrounded by wildflowers. Between them stood a little girl with brown hair and bright eyes. Vivian swallowed hard. She had been 14 when the photograph was taken. 14 when life had still felt normal. 14 before she learned the truth about herself. Her thumb brushed gently across the image. She could still remember that summer afternoon. The smell of fresh grass, the warmth of the sun, the sound of her mother laughing. And then she remembered the day everything changed. The day her scent emerged. At first, she had not understood why strangers suddenly paid attention to her. Why certain wolves seemed unusually interested whenever she entered a room. Why her parents began exchanging worried glances when they thought she was not looking. It was her mother who finally explained. Vivian was an omega. A rare omega. The kind powerful wolves spent years searching for. The kind whose scent could attract attention from far beyond her own pack. Her father had immediately begun making plans. New locks on doors. Longer routes home from school. Quiet conversations with trusted friends. Then came the herbs. Special blends passed down through generations. Rare plants capable of concealing an omega's scent from most wolves. They were not perfect, but they worked, at least for a while. Vivian carefully unfolded the letter inside the box. The handwriting belonged to her mother. She had read the words hundreds of times, yet they still felt new every time. If you are reading this, it means you are still safe. Promise me you will never feel ashamed of who you are. Hiding is not weakness. Surviving is not weakness. One day the right people will know your truth. Until then, protect your heart and trust yourself. Vivian closed her eyes. For 8 years those words had guided every decision she made. Every disguise. Every move. Every sacrifice. She folded the letter and placed it back inside the box. Then she stood and glanced once more toward the festival beyond the window. Thousands of people celebrated beneath the moon without knowing her secret. That was how it needed to remain. Yet as another cheer erupted from the courtyard below, unease settled deeper inside her. The king had returned. And for reasons she could not explain, the carefully built walls around her life suddenly felt far less secure than they had only a few hours ago. Far across the palace grounds, where music echoed through marble corridors and crystal chandeliers illuminated vaulted ceilings, Damien Blackthorne stood alone for a brief moment before entering the grand hall. The celebration waiting beyond the doors had been planned for months. Hundreds of nobles had traveled across the kingdom to attend. Advisors expected speeches. Pack leaders expected negotiations. Young wolves dreamed of attracting attention from influential families. Yet none of those things occupied the king's thoughts. His silver eyes remained fixed on the moon shining through a tall, arched window. 8 years. The number surfaced in his mind again. 8 years since the scent first appeared. It had happened during a winter storm in the northern mountains. Damien had been traveling between border settlements when a sudden breeze carried something unfamiliar through the air. Soft, warm, impossible to forget. The scent lasted only seconds before disappearing completely. At first he dismissed it. Then it happened again months later in another territory nearly 300 miles away. Then again the following year. Every encounter lasted only moments. Every time he arrived too late. Every time the scent vanished before he could identify its owner. Most kings would have forgotten such a mystery. Damien never did. He remembered every detail, every location, every season, every fleeting trace. Over time, the scent became more than a curiosity. It became a question he could not answer. And Damien hated unanswered questions. The massive doors behind him opened. Your Majesty. Damien turned toward the speaker. It was Theodore Ashford, his oldest advisor. Theodore adjusted his formal jacket before approaching. The ballroom is ready. Representatives from every major territory have arrived. Damien nodded. Good. Theodore hesitated. You seem distracted. Damien looked away. Do I? Only when you are thinking about something important. A faint smile touched Theodore's face. Or someone important. Damien said nothing. That silence was answer enough. Theodore sighed. The scent again. Yes. You still believe she exists. Damien's gaze hardened slightly. I know she exists. Theodore studied him carefully. 8 years is a long time. Not long enough to stop looking. The advisor folded his arms. And if she does not wish to be found? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Damien's expression. It disappeared almost immediately. Then there is a reason. Theodore raised an eyebrow. You always say that. Because it is true. Damien stepped toward the ballroom entrance. No one spends 8 years hiding without a reason. The advisor followed beside him. And tonight? Damien glanced toward the crowded hall ahead. Music drifted through the doorway. Laughter followed. Hundreds of conversations blended together beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. Tonight feels different, Damien said quietly. Theodore frowned. Different how? Damien could not explain it. For days an unusual feeling had lingered at the edge of his instincts. Not certainty, not recognition. Something deeper, like standing before a locked door and knowing someone was finally reaching for the handle on the other side. The sensation had grown stronger the moment he entered the capital. Stronger still as the festival began. I think she is here, he admitted. Theodore stared at him. Here? In the city? Damien slowly nodded. Somewhere. Before Theodore could respond, another burst of cheers erupted from the ballroom. Guests had noticed the king's arrival. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance. Damien straightened his shoulders and stepped forward. The crowd immediately parted. Conversations faded. Wolves bowed their heads as he entered. Yet even as he acknowledged greetings and formal introductions, part of his attention remained elsewhere. Searching, listening, waiting. Because for the first time in 8 years, the feeling was stronger than ever. And somewhere inside the palace walls, a woman who believed she had successfully hidden from the world was unknowingly moving closer to the moment that would change everything. The Moon Festival reached its peak just after 9 o'clock. Music flowed through every corridor of the palace while guests moved between ballrooms, gardens, and moonlit terraces. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers. Noble families exchanged smiles and carefully chosen words. From a distance, the evening appeared perfect. Vivian wished she could disappear from it entirely. She remained inside the library for nearly another hour, organizing records and pretending she could not hear the celebration outside. Unfortunately, palace attendants were never allowed to avoid festival duties for long. A sharp knock sounded against the door. Before Vivian could answer, Clara stepped inside, carrying a tray lined with sealed invitations. There you are, Clara said. I have been looking everywhere. Vivian immediately sensed trouble. What happened? Clara groaned dramatically. 3 attendants called in sick. Which means congratulations, you have been promoted to emergency festival service. Vivian closed her eyes. No. Yes. Clara placed the tray into her hands. You only have to deliver invitations to the West Ballroom. Vivian looked toward the crowded palace beyond the doorway. There will be hundreds of people there. Exactly. Nobody will notice one more attendant. If only that were true, Vivian thought. 30 minutes later, she found herself walking through one of the busiest sections of the palace. Every instinct urged her to turn around. Guests filled the marble hallways. Servants hurried between events. The scent of flowers, candles, and expensive perfumes blended into a dizzying cloud. Vivian tightened her grip on the tray and focused on her task. Deliver the invitations. Avoid attention. Return to the library. Simple. At least that was the plan. She had almost reached the West Ballroom when a young boy suddenly darted around a corner. He could not have been older than 8. Laughing as he chased another child, he collided directly into her. Oh, Vivian gasped. The tray slipped from her hands. Invitations scattered across the polished floor. The boy immediately stopped. I am sorry, he blurted. I did not see you. It is okay, Vivian said quickly. She knelt and began gathering the papers. The child dropped beside her to help. Several invitations had slid beneath a nearby table. As Vivian reached for them, the leather satchel hanging from her shoulders struck the edge of a chair. The buckle came loose. Time seemed to slow. Her heart dropped. The small cloth pouch containing her herbs slipped from the satchel and fell onto the marble floor. The impact split the fabric. Dried leaves scattered across the ground. A faint earthy scent drifted into the air. Vivian froze. Every color seemed to drain from her face. No, not here. Not now. She immediately reached for the herbs, trying to gather them before anyone noticed. The boy looked confused. Miss? But Vivian barely heard him. Her pulse thundered inside her ears. The herbs were not dangerous by themselves. The danger was what happened when they were gone. Already she could feel the faintest change, like a protective wall beginning to crack, like a door slowly opening. Across the palace, several floors away, Damien Blackthorne paused in the middle of a conversation. A nobleman was speaking about trade routes. Damien never heard the rest of the sentence. Something had reached him. Faint, fleeting, almost impossible to detect. Yet his entire body went still. Theodore noticed immediately. What is it? Damien's silver eyes narrowed. For one brief second he had sensed it again. That same impossible scent. Soft. Familiar. The one he had chased for 8 years. Then it vanished. The king slowly turned toward the ballroom entrance. Theodore followed his gaze. Damien. The Alpha King said nothing. Somewhere inside the palace, a hidden thread had finally moved. And for the first time, it felt close enough to touch. Vivian's hands moved quickly as she gathered the scattered herbs from the floor. Every second felt painfully loud. Around her, guests continued walking through the corridor, unaware of the panic building inside her chest. The young boy helped collect the invitations, glancing up with concern. Are you all right, miss? He asked softly. Vivian forced a smile she did not feel. I am fine. But she was not fine. She could already sense it. The familiar shield created by the herbs was weakening faster than normal. Usually she consumed a fresh mixture every morning and evening. The protection remained stable for hours. Tonight was different. Too much of the blend had been lost. Too much exposed to the air. Her fingers trembled as she shoved the remaining herbs back into the torn pouch. She needed to leave immediately. She needed privacy. She needed to prepare another mixture before anyone noticed. There you are. The sharp voice made her freeze. Vivian looked up. Standing near the ballroom entrance was Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, one of the palace's most influential noblewomen. Tall, elegant, and known for noticing details others missed, Beatrice rarely spoke to attendants unless something had captured her interest. Unfortunately, her attention was now fixed entirely on Vivian. Beatrice's eyes narrowed as she approached. What was that smell? Vivian's stomach dropped. Excuse me. Those herbs. Beatrice gestured toward the torn pouch. I recognized them. Several nearby guests slowed their conversations. Curiosity spread quickly among noble circles. Vivian stood carefully. It is only a personal remedy. Beatrice did not look convinced. A remedy for what? Vivian searched for an answer. Any answer. Before she could speak, another voice joined the conversation. Those are scent herbs, are they not? A younger nobleman stepped closer. My family uses similar plants during long journeys. Beatrice folded her arms. Not those herbs. The woman studied Vivian with growing suspicion. These are much rarer. More eyes turned toward them. Vivian felt exposed beneath every stare. She had spent years avoiding exactly this situation. Yet somehow it was unfolding in the center of the royal palace. I really should return to my duties, she said quietly. She attempted to step away. Beatrice blocked her path. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. One moment. The corridor had become noticeably quieter. Conversations faded as guests sensed drama. A few people drifted closer. Others watched from a distance. Vivian could feel her heartbeat in her throat. You seem nervous, Beatrice observed. Most attendants do not carry rare scent herbs. Please excuse me. Why? Beatrice asked. What exactly are you hiding? The question landed like a stone. Vivian's mouth went dry. Somewhere deep inside, instinct screamed for her to run. Not because these people knew the truth. They did not. Not yet. But because they were getting closer. Far too close. The nobleman bent slightly and picked up one of the dried leaves still resting on the floor. He examined it beneath the corridor lights. His expression changed immediately. Wait. Silence spread. I know this plant. Several heads turned toward him. The man looked from the herb to Vivian. This is moonroot. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. Moonroot. Yes. He swallowed. It is often used in advanced scent concealment formulas. The air seemed to leave Vivian's lungs. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Questions followed. Curious whispers. Suspicious glances. Suddenly, everyone wanted answers. And several floors away, inside the grand ballroom, Damien Blackthorne stopped walking once again. The faint trace he had sensed earlier had returned. Stronger this time. Much stronger. His silver eyes lifted toward the corridor beyond the ballroom doors. Theodore saw the change immediately. You found something. Damien did not answer. Because for the first time in 8 years, he was absolutely certain. He was no longer chasing a memory. She was here. The corridor felt smaller with every passing second. More guests had gathered around the growing commotion, their curiosity feeding on whispered theories and uncertain conclusions. Vivian stood at the center of it all, clutching the damaged pouch against her chest, while dozens of eyes examined her, as if she were suddenly a puzzle waiting to be solved. She hated attention. She always had. For 8 years, she had carefully shaped a life built on quiet routines, hidden corners, and ordinary expectations. Now that life felt as fragile as glass. Moonroot is not common, the nobleman continued. Most wolves never even see it. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Vivian could hear fragments of conversations all around her. Why would an attendant carry that? What is she hiding? Do you think she is important? Lady Beatrice remained focused entirely on Vivian. Perhaps you should explain. Vivian forced herself to stay calm. Panic would only make things worse. There is nothing to explain. Then why conceal your scent? The question struck harder than the others. Several nearby guests exchanged surprised looks. The implication was obvious. Too obvious. Vivian's pulse raced. She needed to leave. Immediately. Before speculation became certainty. Before someone recognized the signs. Before the wrong person arrived. She turned toward an open hallway. Excuse me. Stop. The command came from Beatrice. Not shouted. Simply firm. Confident. The kind of voice that expected obedience. Vivian froze despite herself. A heavy silence settled across the corridor. Then another sound emerged. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Approaching from the far end of the hall. One by one, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Expressions changed. The atmosphere shifted so quickly, it almost felt physical. The crowd began parting without being asked. Guests stepped aside. Nobles straightened their posture. Even Lady Beatrice lowered her chin slightly. Vivian did not need to look to know who was coming. Every instinct inside her already knew. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The footsteps drew closer, then stopped. Silence swallowed the corridor. Vivian stared at the marble floor. She could not bring herself to look up. Not yet. Not when she could feel his presence standing only a few feet away. What is happening here? The voice was calm, deep, controlled. Yet somehow every word carried through the corridor effortlessly. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Beatrice stepped forward. Your Majesty. Damien Blackthorne's silver eyes swept across the gathered guests before settling briefly on the torn herbs scattered across the floor. Theodore stood several feet behind him, observing everything carefully. There appears to be a misunderstanding, Beatrice explained. This attendant was carrying concealment herbs. Damien said nothing. The silence stretched. Vivian could feel his attention resting on her, not passing over her, not glancing in her direction, focused entirely on her. Her hands tightened around the pouch. Every warning instinct she possessed screamed at her to leave, to run, to disappear. Yet her feet refused to move. Damien took a single step forward, then another. The crowd retreated even farther. Nobody wanted to stand between the king and whatever had captured his interest. Theodore watched the scene unfold with growing concern, because he recognized that look. Damien only wore that expression when he was absolutely certain of something. Vivian finally gathered enough courage to raise her eyes. The moment she did, the world seemed to narrow. Silver eyes met gray-blue ones across the corridor. For one heartbeat, neither of them moved. Vivian felt an unfamiliar sensation ripple through her chest. Not fear. Not exactly. Something deeper. Something impossible to name. Damien's expression remained unreadable, yet his gaze never wavered. 8 years of searching. 8 years of questions. 8 years of uncertainty. and standing before him was the first person who had ever made every instinct he possessed fall completely silent. Because for the first time since the search began, he was no longer looking for a scent. He was looking at her. The corridor remained completely silent. Nobody seemed willing to breathe. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt whatever was unfolding between the Alpha King and the quiet attendant standing before him. Vivian felt trapped beneath Damien's gaze. Not judged, not threatened, simply seen. And somehow that felt even more dangerous. For years, she had perfected the art of being overlooked. Tonight, that illusion was falling apart piece by piece. Damien's eyes moved briefly toward the damaged pouch in her hands, then to the scattered leaves still resting across the marble floor. Theodore noticed the shift immediately. So did Lady Beatrice. Your Majesty, Beatrice said carefully. These herbs appear to be scent concealment herbs. Damien did not look away from Vivian. I know. The simple answer sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Vivian's stomach tightened. She could feel dozens of curious eyes studying her. Questions multiplied around her. The attention she feared. Most was no longer avoidable. Damien took another step forward. Only a few feet separated them now. Vivian Hartwell. Her breath caught. She had never introduced herself. Neither had anyone else. The realization seemed to ripple through the crowd as well. Several guests exchanged startled glances. Vivian stared at him. How do you know my name? The question escaped before she could stop it. For the first time, something softened in Damien's expression. I know many things. The answer only confused her more. His attention shifted toward the torn pouch. May I? Vivian immediately understood what he meant. Panic surged through her chest. No. The response came too quickly. Too desperately. Several nearby nobles noticed. Damien noticed as well. Vivian. His voice remained calm. Those herbs have been part of your life for a long time, have they not? She said nothing. Because the answer was yes. Longer than almost anyone could imagine. Damien slowly extended his hand. Not demanding. Not forceful. Simply waiting. Vivian looked at the pouch. Then at him. Every instinct urged her to refuse. Yet something in his expression stopped her. There was no mockery there. No cruelty. No desire to embarrass her. Only certainty. The kind of certainty she had spent years running from. Her fingers loosened slightly. Damien accepted the pouch carefully. The corridor became so quiet that the distant music from the ballroom sounded miles away. Vivian felt her pulse racing. Theodore watched closely. Beatrice watched closely. Everyone watched closely. Damien opened the damaged pouch and studied the remaining herbs inside. Then he released a slow breath. 8 years. 8 years of searching. 8 years of questions. 8 years of chasing a mystery that always disappeared before he could reach it. The answer had been standing inside his palace all along. His hand closed around the herbs. The dried leaves crumbled softly between his fingers. A faint earthy scent drifted away. Then another scent emerged beneath it. Delicate. Warm. Impossible to mistake. It spread through the corridor like moonlight spilling across still water. Several wolves immediately froze. Others blinked in surprise. The whispers stopped completely. Vivian's eyes widened. Her protective barrier was gone. The secret she had carried for 8 years was no longer hidden. Damien closed his eyes briefly as the scent reached him fully. Every memory returned at once. Every fleeting trace. Every unanswered question. Every impossible encounter. When he opened his eyes again, they settled on Vivian with quiet certainty. And for the first time since she was 14 years old, there was nowhere left for her to hide. The revelation spread through the corridor faster than any rumor ever could. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The scent lingering in the air had answered questions that words never could. Vivian felt every eye upon her. Some were surprised. Some were curious. Others seemed completely stunned. Yet none of them frightened her as much as the expression in Damien's silver eyes. There was no triumph there. No satisfaction. Only understanding. And somehow that made her chest ache even more. Vivian lowered her gaze. I never wanted this. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The words broke the silence like fragile glass. Damien remained still. Never wanted what? She laughed softly, though there was no humor in the sound. To be noticed. Memories surfaced before she could stop them. Long years spent changing towns. Leaving jobs. Avoiding friendships that became too close. Always watching. Always careful. Always waiting for the day someone would discover what she was. You do not understand, she said quietly. People change when they find out. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Theodore studied her thoughtfully. Damien never looked away. Then help me understand. The simple request surprised her. No demands. No orders. Just a question. Vivian swallowed hard. My parents spent years protecting me. Her fingers tightened around the empty pouch. Every choice they made was about keeping me safe. They taught me how to hide, how to move on when people became suspicious, how to disappear before anyone could decide I was something valuable. The last word felt strange. Valuable. Because for most of her life, she had never felt valuable. Only vulnerable. The corridor remained silent as she continued. After they were gone, hiding was all I knew. Her eyes lifted briefly toward Damien. So I stayed invisible. Something shifted in the king's expression. A sadness she had not expected. Not pity. Understanding. The kind that came from carrying burdens for a very long time. Theodore suddenly seemed to realize something. 8 years, he murmured. Damien nodded once. The movement was almost imperceptible. Vivian frowned. What does that mean? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Theodore looked at her. For 8 years, His Majesty has been searching for someone. Confusion crossed Vivian's face. Searching? A scent, Theodore said. One that appeared and vanished again and again. Several nobles stared openly now. Even Lady Beatrice looked shocked. Vivian turned toward Damien. You were searching for me? Damien's answer came without hesitation. Yes. The honesty of it stole her breath. Not because of the words themselves. Because of how easily he said them. As though there had never been another answer. As though the search had become part of him. Vivian shook her head slightly. You do not even know me. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Damien's mouth. The first anyone in the corridor had seen that evening. Then perhaps that should change. The statement drew surprised reactions from the crowd. Before anyone could speak, a young nobleman stepped forward. He was handsome, well-dressed, and clearly eager to attract attention. Your Majesty, he said carefully. If she is unclaimed, surely proper introductions should happen before assumptions are made. The corridor immediately grew tense. Theodore closed his eyes briefly as though anticipating trouble. Damien slowly turned toward the nobleman. His expression remained calm. Yet the temperature of the room seemed to change instantly. Assumptions, Damien repeated. The nobleman swallowed. I only meant that many families would be interested in meeting Miss Hartwell. The statement was polite, reasonable, completely harmless. Yet Vivian felt the warning before anyone else did. Because Damien's attention returned to her immediately afterward. And for the first time that evening, everyone in the corridor understood the same thing. The search was over. What happened next would change far more than Vivian Hartwell's life. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire palace. Hundreds of guests had gathered beyond the corridor by now. News traveled quickly during festivals, and word of the unusual scene had already spread from ballroom to ballroom. Noble families stood shoulder to shoulder beside attendants, advisors, and visiting pack leaders. Everyone waited. Everyone watched. Vivian wished she could disappear. Yet for the first time in years, she did not step backward. She simply stood there beneath the palace lights, surrounded by strangers who now knew the secret she had spent 8 years protecting. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something nobody expected. He stepped past the crowd, past the nobles, past the advisors. He moved until he stood directly before her. The entire corridor held its breath. Vivian's pulse quickened. She had no idea what he intended to do. Neither did anyone else. Then, before hundreds of witnesses, Damien Blackthorne lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Theodore nearly dropped the folder he was carrying. Lady Beatrice's eyes widened. Several guests openly stared in disbelief. Kings did not kneel, especially not in public, especially not before palace attendants. Yet Damien remained exactly where he was, looking up at Vivian with complete certainty. Your Majesty, someone whispered from the crowd. Damien ignored them. His attention never left her face. Vivian felt as though the world had stopped turning. What are you doing? She asked softly. Damien's answer was simple. Making a choice. Her heart skipped. He continued before she could respond. For years I searched for answers without knowing your name. His voice carried clearly through the silent corridor. Tonight, I learned your name. I learned your story. And I learned that while I was searching for you, you were spending every day trying to protect yourself. Vivian blinked rapidly. Emotion tightened her throat. Damien rose slowly to his feet. You believed. Being invisible was the safest way to live. His expression softened. But you should never have had to hide. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire palace listened. Vivian felt tears gathering despite her efforts to remain composed. "You do not know what happens now," she whispered. Damien nodded. "I do." He glanced briefly toward the assembled crowd before returning his gaze to her. "Now nobody will make you disappear again." The statement carried no threat, no anger, only promise. Theodore smiled quietly to himself. For the first time all evening, the tension began to fade from the room. Vivian looked around at the hundreds of faces surrounding them. Earlier, those same eyes had terrified her. Now something felt different. The fear that had followed her for 8 years no longer seemed quite so large. Because she was not standing alone anymore. Damien extended his hand. Not as a command. Not as a king. Simply as a man offering trust. Vivian stared at it for several seconds. Then she remembered her mother's letter. "One day the right people will know your truth. Until then, protect your heart and trust yourself." Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Warmth spread through her chest. Not because every problem had disappeared. Not because life had suddenly become easy. But because for the first time in years, she was no longer carrying everything by herself. The palace erupted into applause. Smiles spread across faces throughout the corridor. Even Lady Beatrice laughed softly at her own mistaken assumptions. Above them, beyond the palace windows, the full moon illuminated the city below. Lanterns glowed across rooftops. Music returned to the festival. And standing beneath the silver light, Vivian realized something extraordinary. The future she had feared for so long had finally arrived. Yet instead of losing herself, she had finally been found.